Hello, my name is Richard Selby from the technical support team at the Correct Group, and in this series of videos I'd like to go through the subject of importing survey data into TBC and the checking and initial processing of that data. So the initial series of videos will cover options relevant to that process, such as setting up project templates with various settings, various default settings, some of the data viewing options, survey data import and checks, and then lastly dealing with warning flags. So the first video in the series, this video, it's going to deal with the project templates and settings, specifically looking at default settings for units, view settings, computation settings, network adjustment, default standard errors, and coordinate systems. So in this initial series of videos, we're not looking in detail specifically at traverse adjustment or network adjustment, but as we're in the business of looking at the templates and the settings for those workflows within here, then it makes sense to cover some sensible defaults whilst we're setting up the templates. So having said that, now let's move over to Trimble Business Center and set up some of these defaults and create some new templates. I've launched Trimble Business Center version 5.52, and from the File menu I'm going to go to New and see my list of templates. So all of these are default templates that are installed with Trimble Business Center for a new installation, with the exception of this one here, which is a new one that I created and which I'm going to update throughout the course of the video series. So it's perhaps best to begin by configuring all the required settings in a metric template as mentioned for common survey data processing operations. So I'll open a new project using that metric template and launch the project settings dialog from the cog button in the top left corner of the screen, and we'll begin to take a look. The first one in here to consider will be units, and if we look here in the coordinates subsection within units, we can see that the default number of places for coordinates will be 3. It's for grid coordinates, and for decimal latitude and longitudes it will be to 5 decimal places. I would suggest, if you do any GNSS processing, to change that to 9 decimal places should you exchange data in a CSV file, for example, in latitude, longitude coordinates and in decimal degrees. The next option we'll look at in here is Chainage. Again, if you're working with corridor data in TBC, depending on your local preference, you might want to change the way that Chainage is displayed. I'm going to change it to no formatting as the default setting for this template. For the purposes of this video series, I'm going to leave units and move on to view. And in here we'll begin by looking at the plan view plot scale option. I'm going to change that to 1 to 200, which will give some idea of the size of text and symbols scaled from ground units into the size of objects that would be produced on a plot drawing of the scale chosen. So if you're working with a code library and you're drafting to create topo survey drawings, that is a useful change to make. Scrolling down, we'll just go to the optical spreadsheet next. Now the optical spreadsheet details information about observations taken by a total station within spreadsheet form, and it's possible to turn on and off information in various columns in that spreadsheet. One in particular that's very useful for subsequent troubleshooting and data checking is to display the prism constant. So change the prism constant value to show if that is something that you check in your checks procedure. Next, we'll move on to computations. One of the options that we can see in this part of the dialog is how side shots are handled. So these would be measurements to points where the instrument is not set over that point. So it's points measured to a target, essentially. There could be multiple observations to a point target, although in the case of a standard topographic survey there may only be one measurement, one single observation to many of the points in the survey. But if there are multiple measurements to points in the survey, then it's possible to change the default way these are handled. So for example, this could be changed to a simple mean of all the observations made to a particular point. There are other options in here. Again, information on what these options are given the tooltip at the base of the dialog here and in the help. Within here, let's look at point tolerances, specifically survey quality point tolerances. This comes into play when there's more than one observation to a position or data that can add to a coordinated position for a point. And this shows how much tolerance there is specified for those points to agree, or those observations to agree in terms of positioning, in order to be accepted without a warning flag appearing. Now, depending on perhaps the type of processing you might be setting up the template to perform, will determine what level you might want to set this to, and consequently the number of flags that could be generated within the project, warning flags that is. Perhaps if we change this to a horizontal tolerance of 15 mil and a vertical of 30 would be acceptable for many topographical survey means. So if observations generate a coordinate and all of those observations and perhaps keyed in coordinates or imported coordinates all agree within a tolerance of 15 mil horizontally, then no warning flag will be displayed. But if any one of them or multiples deviate from the given coordinate for a point by more than 15 mil, that keyed in or imported coordinate or that measurement which is resulting in a coordinate will be flagged up as a warning. In here, it's possible to similarly set a tolerance for mean angles, so the amount of residual or difference from the mean that an individual measurement within a series of angles can be before a warning flag is generated. So the default here is 10 seconds and 15 seconds, and for many general survey purposes, those will be quite okay. So we can leave those at 10 and 15 seconds respectively. The slope distance is set at 5 mil plus 2 parts per million. This initial series of videos is really to look at the general process of importing and checking data, not to go too deep into traverse adjustment or network adjustment, but as we're in the project settings, it makes sense to look at some of the settings for these operations. So I scroll down a little bit here, we can see we have the option for traverse settings. So this is conventional Bowditch type traverse adjustment. So settings that can be made, such as the maximum angular misclosure per station within the traverse and min horizontal precision value. The default here is 1 to 50,000. Just change both of these to 1 to 20,000, but of course these can be changed when it comes to processing a traverse to any specifications or values required. Moving on to the network adjustment. In the general settings, the default is to ignore side shots. In the network adjustment, the least squared based adjustment, and it is probably advisable to leave that as it is unless there's a specific requirement to adjust side shots as well. And for terrestrial data, there's the option here as to whether the adjustment will be in the vertical as well or just the horizontal only, and again the default selection is yes, which we'll leave as yes. In terms of processing the terrestrial data, so total station data, there's an option here as to whether to use mean angles or to use individual observations. So if a round of angle has been performed, the mean result of the observations in the round can be taken into the network adjustment, or all of the observations can be taken in. Again, it's going to come down to the amount of data going into the process. The default is use mean angles, and again that is a good default to keep it on, unless when you come to do a network adjustment that needs to be changed. Default standard errors, a couple of things to change here. So again, standard error information could be carried in with the survey data, but it can also be defined in the project settings. So we'll take the option to control everything through the project settings. In terms of the other input data types here, for leveling, default source for the standard errors is the level editor, and for the GNSS data it will be the baseline processor. There's no immediate need to change either of those things. Looking then specifically at the total station, the default standard errors are 1 second in the HAs and the VAs. Slope distance is going to be 3 mil plus 2 parts per million. Then we have the centering error estimates. Again, we're not going into details in this series of videos, but sensible values might be centering errors for the backside and the instrument position as 1 mil, and perhaps for height measurements of 2 mils. What we've changed there are some of the common settings that we might wish to change to have as defaults for general data processing. again, when it comes to processing for specific purposes or projects, of course, they can be changed, but those will be the defaults that will be generated when a particular template is selected, which has those settings. So speaking of templates then, having put those settings in, let's go to File, Save as Template, and this will allow me to store those settings within a template named from my own choice. So as I've already created one previously, I'm just going to update the one created before. And because I've created it before, it will just make sure that I wish to overwrite it, which I do. Now I said to start there with the metric template. Should I wish to use those same settings but with a coordinate system set, again, could go back to project settings, coordinate this system this time and change. Depending on whether you've picked coordinate systems before or not will determine what you see here. Here are coordinate systems I've been using recently, but I could select these from scratch by going to the zone that I want, the system that I want, and the geoid model that I require. So having added the coordinate system to my settings, I would then save that as a new template. With a new name. So whenever I wish to start a new project, I can select either one of my new templates to begin the process. If you have any questions about the settings covered in this video, please get in touch with us using the details shown on the slide. Thank you for watching.